In times of an actual pandemic, does it go without saying a best pandemic movies of all time list should be made? I think so. Pandemic movies, you know how these go by now. At least I hope you would. It starts with one person who gets an infection, and they spread it to more people, and more people, and more people, until it finally just gets out of control. And now the whole world is upside down, and people are dying, and the whole world's a shell of its former self. The basic setup's always the same, but it has led to a few different types of scenarios. Viruses, aliens, zombies, some other mutated creature, whatever it may be. And as of this video, the whole world's experiencing its own pandemic, with the coronavirus putting most of the world on pause and keeping people quarantined in their house until this thing blows over. As of this recording, it's been 15 days for me personally. I think I left my house twice for grocery shopping. But anyway, I feel now's the perfect time to talk about some of the movies that played out some of these scenarios the best. And as my general word of warning, I've seen a lot, but obviously not every single movie under the sun. So I may be leaving off some of your favorites, and if I did, let me know. 5 honorable mentions alphabetically are Anna and the Apocalypse, Contagion, The Omega Man, Planet Terror, and Warm Bodies. All good movies, pretty bad scenarios for these characters to be in, but good movies. And now for my top 10 best pandemic movies of all time. Number 10 is The Crazies from 2010. I find this remake of the 1973 George Romero movie to be extremely underrated. Story-wise, is it the most complex? Not at all. It's a simple premise. There's a virus outbreak, and it turns most of the town into these violent killers, and now a bunch of people in the town are trying to survive. Nothing complex, but it's very tense and extremely fast-paced with a lot of solid action scenes. Plus, it contains one of the most underrated leading men at the forefront, and that's Timothy Olyphant. Anyone who's familiar with his TV work knows he can be a lot of fun when he's allowed to just take charge of a scene, justified being one of the best examples. And that's exactly what he does here as the sheriff of this community. He is an absolute blast to watch, and looking back on this now, knowing how great his TV work is, makes this all the more fun. Combine a great leading man with a very tense atmosphere and you have yourself an enjoyable movie. Number 9 is 12 Monkeys. What makes this movie a bit different than your normal pandemic movie is that it's less about the immediate aftermath of the outbreak and more about society well after the fact. This takes place years after a virus outbreak and stars Bruce Willis as a man who's sent back in time to stop it from happening in the first place. This is one of the more bizarre pandemic movies out there, and that's due to the fact it was directed by Terry Gilliam. It's not comically outlandish like many of his other films are, like Brazil or Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, but it's still chock full of strange imagery and larger-than-life moments that are bound to stick with you once the movie's over. He plays with the concepts of time, memory, and perception, as we see how we always don't remember things exactly how they played out, which leads to some truly incredible moments. Not only is this a tense thriller, but it's also thematically brilliant. Number 8 is The Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978. I've seen both the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956 as well as this one, and while I like both, I gotta say this is the superior one in my opinion. Normally we don't associate alien movies with pandemic movies, but this one's a little different than your average alien movie. Rather than being your typical invasion movie, these aliens take the form of small pods with pink flowers, and use it to take over the bodies of humans, and it happens all around the world. This leads to a really eerie movie. The behavior these aliens can exhibit when trying to replicate a human can be genuinely creepy. They're totally devoid of emotion, and they'll let out a shrill scream whenever they see a human that hasn't been converted yet. It still sends chills down my spine every time. Philip Kaufman's direction leads to a very frightening atmosphere, and in turn leads to 2 hours of pure intensity. Number 7 is Dawn of the Dead from 1978. I've seen both this as well as the 2004 remake, and while I like both, nothing compares to the original. When it comes to George Romero's Living Dead series, I personally still think that Night of the Living Dead is the best of the 3, but I didn't include that here because that really just deals with one isolated incident. This shows a zombie invasion on a full-blown scale and is one of the most emotionally compelling zombie movies of all time. Taking place within this mall, it shows the mass hysteria of a frightened public, unable to deal with these creatures, and it shows the psychological effects it can have on certain certain individuals. The film was co-written by Italian filmmaker Dario Argento, who also composed the score for this movie. And you can really feel his influence here. It's filled with bloody, colorful violence and a chilling score that keeps the intensity moving. Still as entertaining today as it was when it was first released, this is still one of the best horror movies of all time. Number 6 is Slither. Once upon a time, James Gunn was specifically known for bloody, over-the-top, low-budget genre movies. And while I love his superhero work so far, I do hope that he eventually returns to original films like this at some point. This movie bombed at the box office, and more than likely, you haven't seen it. But it's really underrated and does a wonderful job of mixing elements of both horror and comedy. This is another rare pandemic movie that revolves specifically around aliens. A parasite from another planet crashes on Earth, takes over the body of one person, which in turn spreads to a whole town being infected. And it is insane. Since this is a comedy, the idea of a parasite taking over someone's body leads to a lot of gross-out humor, along with moments of bloody, cartoonish, over-the-top violence that can be hilarious. Not only is this a great way to kick off James Gunn's career, but it's also a modern cult classic. Number 5 is 28 Days Later. It might be hard to believe, but there was once a time where zombie movies were not the most popular thing around. And that's despite the fact that George Romero's Living Dead series was really popular. But while that popularity skyrocketed once The Walking Dead came out, this was the first movie that paved the way forward. Especially since this popularized the concept of fast-moving zombies, which was unheard of at the time. Beyond just being an innovator, this is just also a damn good horror movie. There's always been an intensity to nearly all of director Danny Boyle's movies, but they were mostly in the form of gripping character drama. But this first proved that when he's behind a genre movie, he can bring out a whole different sort of intensity. This movie is frightening with a gripping story and eerie atmosphere, brought about by some stunning camera work that really sets the tone and continuously keeps your attention. To this day, this is still one of the finest zombie movies out there. Number 4 is Wreck. Remember when found footage horror movies were super popular for a few years? This was made when the genre first started gaining traction in 2007, and while the genre has died down since the mid-2010s, I admit I still have a soft spot for these movies, with this one being one of my favorites. Taking place within an apartment building, this focuses on a reporter and her cameraman stuck in this building as all the tenants begin experiencing animalistic behavior. This leads to a super creepy film that really nails the real-life aspect that found footage movies are known for. It also benefits from a really tight script. It's not even 80 minutes, but it really works to the movie's advantage as we get one legitimate scare after the other, after the other, after the other. There are countless entries to the found footage subgenre, but this one remains one of the absolute best. Number 3 is Children of Men. Like 12 Monkeys, this is another movie that deals with life well after the outbreak. This pandemic here is a plague and radiation, mixed with mass infertility that leads to the human race being close to extinction. Pretty heavy stuff, right? But when a movie's set well after a pandemic first breaks out, it gives way for much more gripping character drama, rather than being an event-based movie, since we're now dealing with these characters in the midst of their new day-to-day lives. There's much more of an actual arc to follow. And we have some great characters to follow here, from Clive Owen's Theo, to Julianne Moore's Julian, to my absolute favorite part of the movie, Michael Caine as Jasper. He brings a little bit of humor to alleviate the tension in even the most depressing parts. And to be clear, this is far from a feel-good movie, with some really moody atmosphere brought to life brilliantly by Alfonso Cuarón's direction. That being said, it's also a consistently engaging story, with plenty of thought-provoking themes that make it well worth watching. Number 2 is Shaun of the Dead. You know, of the 3 Flavors Cornetto trilogy that Edgar Wright made, I always hear Hot Fuzz listed as the best of the 3. And while that movie's excellent, I gotta admit, this one is still my favorite. I mean, it is totally off the wall and endlessly hilarious. I can still rattle off a lot of the movie's more quotable dialogue easily, and I still get a lot of great laughs whenever I see random clips of this. I remember back when this was first released, going into it I was expecting more of a parody, especially given the fact that the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead was released that same year, but I was surprised to see not just a totally original and fun zombie movie, but something of a clever satire, poking fun at the most mundane aspects of working class life. It's a really smart movie, filled with excellent performances from both Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, and it remains one of my favorite comedies to this day. And my number 1 favorite pandemic movie of all time is, of course, The Happening. I mean, it couldn't be anything else. Yes, The Happening. This is, of course, a modern classic. Centered around killer plants terrorizing humans, this is one of the most intense movies I've ever seen. and it was robbed of so many awards. I mean, M. Night Shyamalan deserved both a Best Original Screenplay and a Best Director nomination, and he was robbed of both. And who can also forget Mark Wahlberg's emotionally complex, gripping performance? I mean, that was Performance of the Year right there. You think he was great in something like The Departed? Well, you're really missing out on this one. I am of course kidding, but imagine though, The Happening. Anyway, here's my real number one. Number one is the Planet of the Apes reboot trilogy. And I know I'm cheating with this one. This is technically 3 movies. And really though, the pandemic only takes place within the first movie. And the other 2 movies take place well after the fact, similar to Children of Men. But they all tell one complete story, so as far as I'm concerned, they all go together. I love the original Planet of the Apes movie from 1968. It's still a classic. It's actually one of my favorite sci-fi movies of all time. This trilogy marks a rare instance where the remake is actually just as good as the original, if not better, even if these technically tell a completely different story than the original. These have the look and feel of a big budget blockbuster, and to be totally clear, they are. But unlike other blockbusters, this can be a really powerful story that shows just how heartless and cruel people can be to not just others, but even to the environment. And at the center of all these movies is Andy Serkis as the main character Caesar, who brings out so much about this character through some beautiful motion capture for the facial expressions and body language. It's honestly better than all the performances for the actual human characters, as great as some of them were. Visually stunning, emotionally intense, and beautifully acted, these are 3 movies that I think will stand the test of time. So surprisingly, not all of these movies can be totally depressing. Some are a bit goofy, some can even be a bit fun, even if none of the situations for any of these characters are necessarily good. While there's a format associated with these sort of movies, like any genre, once you dig in, you'll find that these can be a lot more emotionally complex than they first appear to be. But let me know, what's your favorite pandemic movie? Was it something I listed here? Was it something I left off? Do you have your own top 10? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you like what you see, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay healthy, and I'll catch you next time.